Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says a ceasefire in Gaza has now been delayed until Hamas releases a list of hostages. Just to remind you, the aim of this, and it is a very complicated sequential deal. So essentially 3 hostages to be released first, but they have to name those hostages for this ceasefire to take effect in now 24 minutes time. It is very complicated. We'll talk you through all of it this morning. Georgie Frost, the Times Money Mentors editor-at-large, joins me this morning. Good morning.
A very good morning.
Really nice to see you. Look, this is a very important day. It's a big day, actually, in terms of the ceasefire. I think it's worth saying it's on a knife edge, this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were on air together just immediately after the October the 7th attacks. So I feel like you and I have sort of covered this together. Look, whatever happens with this, and hopefully we'll reach a ceasefire, nobody's won here, no, let's be honest.
Not at all.
I mean, there's 46,000 people who've died. I think that, like you said, it's on a knife edge. I think that Benjamin Netanyahu has got a lot of questions to answer for how the attack was allowed to happen in the first place, and that will come home after sort of, hopefully this has been concluded in some way. But of course we've got Donald Trump coming in tomorrow. He would be very keen for a deal to go ahead. Would he risk Benjamin Netanyahu not having that deal? I think Hamas would say that they, to a degree, have won, as it were.
Do you think?
Can you win? I would imagine so. I think that they haven't. I think the big problem is Benjamin Netanyahu never set out what his plan was. How was it going to end?
It's an extremely good point, and of course Trump incumbency or coming into power tomorrow, there would have been enormous pressure on Netanyahu to do a deal. I mean, I think when you look at this, just in terms of the prisoner swap, 33 hostages to be released in exchange for 1,890 prisoners, which is a huge number of prisoners, and many people on the right in Israel very unhappy about this. Ben Gvir, for example, saying that he voted against this, and he didn't like the detail of this deal at all. And as you say, obviously the pressure coming from the US onto Netanyahu, but also I think your point is really valid. Who has won this?
No, nobody's won this. This is not a winnable. War is not winnable, let's be honest, in how we would understand it. It's not a game either.
No.
But this is a 3-part process, which, as you say, you know, it's all dependent on those 3 parts. So the first one being, as you say, some of the hostages released. Certainly in the initial phase, it will be those who are over 50, children. Can you believe that there are children being held hostage for 15 months or however long it's been? And also Israel moving away from some of the large, the Israeli soldiers moving away from some of the larger cities. And it goes all the way through to the 3rd phase, which is rehabilitation and rebuilding of that area, which will take enormous, I would sort of say, international cooperation to get that done.
Years.
But, absolutely, years.
I mean, it's worth just remembering the figures here. More than 46,870 people have been killed in Gaza.
Yeah.
I mean,
how many people displaced, their homes destroyed? I mean, absolutely, it's
the whole thing is a shocking human tragedy. But you're right. So Hamas, this unprovoked attack on October the 7th, 1,200 people or thereabouts, and of course then you've got the real impact of this and just the true devastation. I don't think we really understand what it's like if you are a Palestinian to be displaced and to be trying to rebuild your life. And of course that's the front page of the Observer this morning, basically saying fears of chaos. Families begin to trek home. Trek home to what?
No, absolutely. And this is where I think Israel, as the sort of democratically elected, etc., I suppose partner, would you call it a partner of America, needs to step up and start rebuilding. But, you know, you don't know what it's like to be Palestinian. I don't know what it's like to live in a country like Israel, where every country all around you wants you not to exist. I mean, there's no simplicity here, and I think politics has come into play as well. You know, Hamas have a lot to blame. There's a lot of people within Gaza that don't agree with Hamas and don't agree with the methods that they've used. Certainly anyone who looked at those shocking images on October the 7th cannot but say how horrendous they were. Absolutely horrific. And I don't think you can either argue as well as to a country's right to get back their hostages. I mean, I keep thinking if someone had come into our country, if they had taken, my sister or my nephew, if they had raped and tortured and done all those things, then I would be, horrified. But then there is absolutely blame on the Israeli government, on Netanyahu, who I think is, politically speaking, was very fragile even before this event happened. And I think, to be fair, he's cracked down extra hard because of the reason that he was caught with, to borrow an American expression, with his pants down.
Very much so. And of course, he is trying to hold together a very fragile coalition. As I said, you've got the right wing pushing him to go harder and faster. I think you're also correct in that there was never an end point. He said he was going to obliterate Hamas, but what does that mean?
No, it's impossible, absolutely impossible. However, I think that the expectations of Hamas when they did it have not come to fruition either. I think that the fact that, there's been quite a lot of instability around that area, instability caused as a result of this. I think Iran have been shown as to be weak, things like Hezbollah as well. I think what they might have hoped for hasn't come about. But yes, I mean, certainly in creating shock, I think has certainly happened.
Just in terms of the timing, and it is very complicated, let me just explain what's going on. So they have to name these 3 hostages to be released today, which is meant to be happening in 20 minutes' time. Over the next few weeks, then, 33 hostages are set to be released in exchange for 1,890 Palestinian prisoners. Israel, at the same time, will pull back its troops in Gaza. No one knows where the location is where these hostages are going to be handed over, so they're sort of preparing for anywhere across the border. Then the second phase, the talks about the terms of the second phase are going to start on day 16 of the first phase. Then they're going to look at trying to achieve a permanent end to the war. Again, the terms of that deal very uncertain at this point. At this point, remaining hostages, including men, would be freed at this stage. More Palestinian prisoners detained in Israeli prisons. And then the third and final stage, as you say, the most complicated, which is rebuilding.
Yeah, absolutely. I do hope, and I am naive in this hope, that this is the war to end the wars here.
Because
I hope that.
But look at history.
No, absolutely.
The Middle East is a hotbed of war.
Of course it is. Of course it is. But you have to hope that this has shocked the world so much to think that we have to do something. And I do think that to a certain extent, if you look at the polls, actually, and they're really difficult to work out, but only 16% of people within Gaza actually would vote for Hamas now.
Yes, of course. So
I do think that now is an opportunity where people have looked and said, actually, there's horrors on both sides, and I do hope...
Of course there are.
I do hope Israel takes a really long, hard look at the way that it's conducted its politics over many, many years. But I do think we need to come to some sort of two-state solution. And don't get me wrong, there are people, and there will always be people, who do not believe Israel has a right to exist.
I agree.
And will never countenance a two-part. But we have got to come to a state, and I think the best way to do this, and I'm not just saying this because I'm a finance person, is to rebuild the economy, to rebuild the houses, etc., and the dignity of the people who live in Gaza. That's the only way, and I think this is where Israel need to stand up. And if you think you have the moral high ground, as I said, democratically elected party or country, you need to go in there and you need to, do the best for those people who have been left behind in this absolute state of an area.
I mean, I think also, just talking to my Jewish friends here, there is a sense of entrenchment. The fact is that they believe Israel is right at all costs, and of course no one is ever right at all costs. No side is ever right at all costs. But also you see this breaking out onto the streets of London, the pro-Palestinian protests. If you go and talk to some of those protesters, I don't think they know what they're protesting about, actually.
Look, it's a very... to a certain extent, I agree with you. I think most of my Jewish friends, in fact, don't think that Israel is completely right. I think the political system, as I said, for decades has been a bit of a mess. The fact that Benjamin Netanyahu's come back again, it seems the same old...
And he's fighting for his political life.
But it seems the same old people keep coming back. And also, it's one of those situations, as I said, you don't know what it's like living with every country all around you wanting you destroyed. However, we know across the world, politicians use fear to their political advantage. And I think for too long that's been used as a political advantage. Don't get me wrong, I have enormous sympathy for both sides. I'm making no judgment here on either side. Those times for questions, for retributions, for all those sorts of, the UN or whoever needs to look at whether international crimes have been committed, etc. There is a time for that, but for now we need to focus on getting some sort of peace, because there is not a lot of that area that's going to be left soon. And I think the world is losing patience and sympathy, I think to a degree, for both, for Hamas and for Israel at the moment. And I just think we need to just find some solution, and I really hope that maybe the fact that this has been so shocking, that there is a drive now to find a solution. And maybe Donald Trump is the person to do it.
Well, you see, I think that is the key to all of this, and I'm very mindful of the fact that he comes into power tomorrow, and there will be enormous political pressure being put on Netanyahu as a result of that.
This is no coincidence, the timing of this.
Not at all. Not at all. The latest is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his country is ready to resume the war against Hamas should talks for a second phase of the ceasefire fail. He gave a televised speech, actually, a few hours ago in Israel. He stressed the ceasefire is temporary and Israel reserves the right to resume strikes in Gaza, and it had the backing of US President-elect Donald Trump to do so. But how much of this is bluster, I'm not quite so sure, because obviously what he's saying is we have agreed. I mean, it's interesting actually listening to Hamas saying, well, we still almost unconditionally support that ceasefire, and Netanyahu sort of hedging his bets.
Yeah, absolutely. But then that goes back to what I said about how I think that Hamas would have viewed this as a victory of sorts. Yeah. Of course they would have done.
How do you view it as a victory when you kill your own people?
But there's a difference. So I understand this. There's a difference in the way that you view. I've heard Hamas leaders inside saying that these are necessary casualties. There is a view that death is the start of something else. It is actually the ultimate martyrdom. How do you fight that? Whereas in Israel, every death is considered an absolute tragedy, whereas this is viewed as slightly different. So I understand that. That's a very different way of fighting. I mean, look, this is the biggest strike, the biggest shock that Hamas, I understand, have ever created. They have managed to garner protests across the world in support of Palestine. So in that regard, yes, I guess, they would view that as they have succeeded. What the long term will be, I don't know.
I don't think
nobody knows at the moment.
And I think it's fair to say they're sitting on a powder keg here. This is last night. Thousands of protesters gathered in Tel Aviv to demand the government ensures the release of further hostages. So there's huge political pressure on Netanyahu here. At the same time, yesterday, several people were wounded in a stabbing attack near a restaurant in Tel Aviv. The attacker was then shot and killed at the scene by a civilian. Apparently, the suspect came to Tel Aviv illegally from Turkam in the occupied West Bank. I'm also very mindful, and look, I'm no expert here, but also the encroachment by Israel on other territory in the West Bank, for example. It goes back to this idea that actually both sides, that if you're an international arbiter, how do you decide what the resolution of this situation is?
Dr. David, my darling, you and I do not.
No, we don't.
We don't. This has taken years. And the problem with this is I remember having a discussion about this when I was at university with a Jewish friend of mine. And, I had no idea about this sort of situation. Very, very naive. And he was like, Georgie, how far back do you want to go?
Yeah, well, that's a very good point, isn't it?
And I thought, that's the reality. You're talking, millennia, to which if you want to go, this is my land, this is my land. The reality is, and I say this with everything, with Trump, with Brexit, with whatever, I have this kind of view of life.
You had to bring that up, didn't you?
Well, I have this view of life that we are where we are. And going over blame and recriminations and all that sort of thing is not helpful.
Yeah, that's right. And also,
from now.
I was taught a long time ago, you have to look at everything that happens now through the prism of history. Until you understand what happened in the past, you will never understand where we are or where we're going.
But this is the same as, I never really got it until I went to Israel and I got that feeling of what it's like to feel like...
So do you think you have to go to Israel to understand the complexities?
My argument with that is not so much about going to Israel, it's more about, and as a historian, I always said that you have to understand history, and to a certain extent you do. But what you also have to understand is you will lack an enormous amount of context of what it's like living within that time and in that moment. And until you know what it's like, how can you?
You can't.
Which is why when we go back and we talk about, getting rid of statues of people who were, racist or slave traders or all this sort of thing. We miss the context of the time. Not that any of those things are right.
I heard another story this morning about Peru and a statue, exactly that, looking through the prism of history once again, saying, well, actually, the statue was inappropriate for all those reasons.
We do not look through the prism of history. We look through the prism of our own eyes and our own experience.
Of course you do. Of
those
course you
people
do.
will not have had.
We'll keep you up to date with the latest on that ceasefire, which is due to begin in 10 minutes' time as and when we get it. I just want to also mention that, of course, there is an awful lot going on because Donald Trump becomes the President of the United States tomorrow. Many notable people are there at the inauguration, including Nigel Farage, Liz Truss is there. I mean, there's a lot that we're going to talk about. The fact is that apparently Trump has said some very nice things about Liz Truss, and there are some great stories this morning. Last night, I tweeted, because it happened to appear on my timeline, saying that Mandelson may well be out as the UK's ambassador to the United States because Donald Trump does not approve. Now, many people said to me this morning, well, hang on a minute, this is an affront to democracy because the US is actually interfering in UK politics. Not true, because the UK ambassador to the United States has to be ratified by the US president. And that will be, number 10 will be in turmoil over all of that. That is the front page of the Sunday Times. And then there's another really interesting article in the Mail, Team Trump's revenge on Starmer for meddling in the US election. They were essentially saying, you sent people over to the United States to interfere in our election. We're going to interfere in your election. We're going to campaign for Nigel Farage.
Which I find a little bit of a strange argument. I mean, I remember at the time that they were heavily critical of it, and then to say, well, you did it, so we're going to do it too.
Well, we'll talk about
you've
that.
Lost the moral high ground.
We'll talk about that. And Sadiq Khan, we spoke a great deal, did we not, yesterday about Sadiq Khan and the fact he wouldn't answer Susan Hall, he wouldn't answer Alex Wilson in the London Assembly. Well, he's written an editorial this morning in The Observer. Khan warns of march of fascism as Trump takes power again. You're the mayor of London. Stop meddling. Honestly, what are you doing? And that got me thinking this morning. And maybe this is a bit of a naughty question. I started thinking this morning, and you know I'm a bit naughty. If you had the power, which politician would you deport?
Oh, you've gone for politician. I thought you said anyone.
I did say anyone. All right, anyone.
I prefer anyone.
Do you prefer? Okay.
Yeah,
if you have the power and you can deport anyone in this country at all,
yeah,
who would it be and why?